Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please subscribe for more daily creepy horror stories. My name's Liam, and I've been working at the port for 2 years now. Night shifts mostly, though I occasionally cover day shifts when someone calls in sick. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well enough, and the rhythm of the job becomes second nature after a while. The port is a sprawling maze of shipping containers stacked like a giant's forgotten game of Jenga, with cranes looming overhead like skeletal sentinels. There's always the faint tang of salt water in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of oil and metal, and the constant hum of machinery. Most nights are uneventful. Unload a few cargo ships, check manifests, and ensure nothing goes missing. I thought I had seen everything this job could throw at me until last week. That was when things shifted from routine to strange. It started with Hartman, our supervisor. If you've ever worked in manual labor, you know the type. Gruff, no nonsense, and allergic to small talk. Hartman was the kind of guy who could bark out orders with a cigarette balanced on his lip and never miss a beat. But when he handed me a laminated sheet of paper, his usual brusque confidence seemed replaced by something else, something like unease. "Follow these," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "We've got a special ship coming in soon. Big money job. Stick to the rules and you'll get a nice bonus." I frowned, taking the paper from him. "Special ship?" I asked, but Hartman just waved me off. "Don't ask questions, Liam," he said sharply. "Just do your job and you'll thank me later." The paper felt heavier than it should in my hands. I skimmed the list and my confusion grew with each line. Rule 1. Always keep your ID badge hidden from sight. Rule 2. If a container opens by itself, do not look inside. Rule 3. Never photograph anything related to the ship. Rule 4. Do not touch any cargo marked with an X. Rule 5. If the ship's horn blows 4 times, evacuate the area immediately. I couldn't help but snort. What kind of ship needs rules like this? Hartman's expression hardened. "It's not your job to understand," he snapped. "Just follow the damn rules." Despite his tone, there was something about his demeanor that didn't sit right. Hartman was usually blunt but composed. Now he sounded almost nervous. Later that night, I showed the rules to Eric and Mike while we unloaded a shipment of car parts. Eric, the youngest on the team, was barely out of high school and had a mouth that never stopped running. He held the paper up to the floodlights, squinting dramatically. "What's this, a scavenger hunt?" he said, laughing. "Keep your badge hidden? Don't touch an X? What are we working for? Pirates?" Mike, who was older and quieter, shook his head. "Nah, it's probably just some legal thing," he said. "You know how these contracts go, liability and all that." Eric smirked, tucking his badge into his jacket with an exaggerated flourish. "Yes, Captain Hartman. Badge hidden. Anything else? Should I salute the ship too?" That got a few laughs from the crew. Even Mike cracked a small smile. But beneath the jokes, I could feel the weight of Hartman's warning. He wasn't the kind to buy into superstition or nonsense, which made his reaction all the more unsettling. Without a word, I slipped my ID badge into my pocket. "You're actually going along with this?" Eric asked, raising an eyebrow. I shrugged. "Hartman's not one for pranks, and I'm not risking my job over something this simple. Just keep your head down and follow the rules." Mike nodded in agreement, though his gaze lingered on the laminated sheet for a moment longer than necessary. "Better safe than sorry," he muttered. The rest of the shift passed quietly, with the usual grind of unloading and logging cargo. But every so often, I caught someone glancing toward the empty berth where the special ship was supposed to dock. It was as if the rules themselves had planted a seed of unease among us. By the end of the night, the jokes had stopped, and the paper with the rules had made its way into everyone's hands. Even Eric, for all his bravado, kept his badge tucked out of sight. Hartman's words echoed in my mind as I clocked out, "Don't ask questions, just do your job." For the first time in 2 years, I found myself wondering if that might not be enough. 3 days after Hartman handed out the rules, the ship arrived. It was well past midnight, the kind of hour when exhaustion dulls the senses and makes you question the smallest details. But there was no mistaking the strangeness of this vessel. It was massive, dwarfing the other ships docked nearby. Its peeling black paint looked like it had been neglected for decades, the hull streaked with rust that bled into the water below. There were no visible markings, no name, no flag, no registration numbers. It didn't even make the usual noises as it glided into position, its movements almost unnaturally smooth, like it wasn't bound by the same laws as everything else on the water. The crew gathered on the dock, staring at it in silence. Even Eric, who always had something to say, stood with his mouth slightly open, his crowbar dangling at his side. "Looks like it came out of a horror movie," Mark muttered, breaking the silence. He was older than most of us, a grizzled veteran of the port who rarely let anything rattle him. "It's just a ship," Mike said, though his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "Let's get to work." Hartman barked orders, snapping us out of our daze. "Quit gawking and start unloading! Remember the rules!" He didn't look at any of us as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the ship like he was expecting it to do something. The work began, but it wasn't like any other night. The usual rhythm of unloading cargo was disrupted by an unspoken tension. The crew moved slower, more cautious, and no one cracked jokes or made small talk. Even the hum of the cranes and forklifts felt quieter, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the air. It happened about an hour into the shift. Eric was stacking crates near one of the containers, his movements jerky like he was trying to distract himself. Then he stopped. "Hey, did you hear that?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Everyone froze, straining to hear. At first there was nothing but the distant lapping of water against the hull. Then, faintly, a soft creak echoed from one of the containers. It sounded like something shifting inside, a noise so subtle it could have been the metal contracting from the cold. "Probably just the cargo settling," Mark said, not looking up from his clipboard. But Eric wasn't convinced. He stepped closer to the container, his head tilted like he was trying to make sense of the sound. "What if something's loose in there? Maybe it's a hazard. Shouldn't we check?" "Don't," I said, sharper than I intended. My voice startled even me. "Remember the rules." Eric hesitated, his hand hovering near the container's latch. "Come on, Liam," he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "What's the worst that could happen?" "Eric, I'm serious," I snapped. "Just let it go." But curiosity had always been Eric's weakness. He grabbed a crowbar from the ground and wedged it under the latch. The sound of the metal prying loose was like a gunshot in the still air. "Eric, stop!" Mike shouted, dropping the crate he was carrying. But it was too late. Eric pried the container open just enough to peek inside. What happened next will stay with me forever. Eric staggered back like he'd been physically struck, the crowbar clattering to the ground. His scream was raw, primal, and it froze the rest of us in place. His eyes were wide, filled with a terror so profound I could feel it in my chest. "What happened?" I yelled, rushing to his side. Eric was trembling, his hands clutching his head. "I saw me," he stammered, barely able to form the words. "It was me, but not me. It was wrong." "What the hell are you talking about?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking. Eric didn't answer. He just kept muttering, his words slurring together in a frantic chant. "It was me. It was pulling me into the dark. I couldn't stop it." We tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. He was pale, drenched in sweat, and shaking so violently that we had to hold him upright. "Get him out of here," Mike said, his voice strained. Hartman appeared then, his face ashen. He didn't ask what happened or even look at Eric. "Get back to work," he ordered, his voice cold and detached. "Now." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in Hartman's eyes stopped me. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was fear. By the time morning came, Eric was gone. His locker was empty, his tools missing, and no one had seen him leave. The container he'd opened was sealed shut, the latch pristine like it had never been touched. Hartman dismissed the incident with a wave of his hand. "Probably quit," he said flatly. "Can't handle the job, I guess." But I knew better. We all did. Something had happened to Eric, something none of us could explain, and none of us wanted to face. The next night at the port was suffocating, though not because of the weather. A thick, unspoken tension hung in the air, heavier than the fog rolling in from the water. Eric's sudden disappearance had shaken everyone, and it was all the crew could talk about. Mark was the first to say what we were all thinking as we gathered near the docked ship. Eric wouldn't just leave. Not like that. Something happened to him. "He was fine before that container," Steve added, his voice low. "Whatever he saw, it wasn't normal." Mike, always the skeptic, crossed his arms. "Maybe he snapped, Couldn't handle the stress. It happens. No, I said firmly. You didn't see the look in his eyes. That wasn't stress. That was fear. Real fear. The conversation spiraled from there, each of us throwing out theories, but none of them felt right. Finally, Mark slammed his clipboard onto a nearby crate. Enough! We need answers. Let's talk to Hartman. Hartman's office was a cramped, dimly lit space tucked behind the main dockyard. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as we crowded into the room. Hartman sat behind his desk, his shoulders hunched as he scribbled notes on a stack of papers. He didn't look up when we entered. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone clipped. Mark stepped forward, his voice trembling but steady. "We need to know what happened to Eric." Hartman didn't pause in his writing. "I already told you. I don't know. Maybe he quit." "Quit?" Steve snapped, his face red with frustration. "He was terrified last night. You saw him. He couldn't even stand up straight." Hartman sighed, finally setting his pen down. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like we were giving him a headache. "Look, this job isn't for everyone. People leave all the time. It's not my problem." "Not your problem?" I echoed, my anger rising. "Eric didn't just leave. His locker's empty. His tools are gone, and that container." Hartman cut me off with a sharp glare. "That's enough." His voice was low but carried a weight that silenced the room. "You want answers? Call HR. File a report. But right now you have work to do." Mark wasn't done. "You know something, don't you? About the ship, about the rules. Why won't you tell us what's really going on?" For a moment, Hartman's mask slipped. His eyes darted to the window where the ship loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible through the mist. When he looked back at us, the fear was gone, replaced by cold indifference. "I'm telling you what I know," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Follow the rules, do your job, and you'll get paid. That's all that matters." We stood there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on us. There was no use arguing. Hartman wasn't going to give us anything, and we all knew better than to push him too far. As we turned to leave, Steve muttered under his breath, "Coward." Hartman ignored him, picking up his pen and resuming his work as if we weren't even there. Back on the dock, the crew was more frustrated than ever. Mike tried to lighten the mood, though his attempt fell flat. "Well, that was a waste of time. Guess we're on our own, huh?" "No kidding," Mark said bitterly. "But something's not right here. Eric's gone, and Hartman's acting like it's just another Tuesday. We need to keep our eyes open." "Yeah," I said quietly, glancing toward the ship. Eyes open and badges hidden. No one laughed. The air was thick with tension as the crew worked through the night. The usual hum of machinery and the distant sound of waves lapping against the dock seemed muted, drowned out by the oppressive silence that had settled over us after Eric's disappearance. We moved like robots, our eyes constantly darting toward the ship, half expecting to see something or someone that shouldn't be there. It was around 2 a.m. when Mike, one of the older workers, noticed it. He was standing by the crane, watching the shadowy outline of the ship against the foggy skyline. At first, I thought he was just staring into the distance, lost in thought, but then I saw his eyes narrow. "Hey, you see that?" Mike asked, his voice low but urgent. I squinted, following his gaze to the ship's deck. Through the low light and mist, I could just make out a dark figure moving slowly along the railing, its movements jerky and unnatural. I shrugged, trying to dismiss the growing unease in my chest. Probably just one of the crew. They always wander off when they're on break. But Mike wasn't convinced. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on the figure. "Nah, it's too big. And why would they be up there alone? No one else is on deck." I felt a twinge of discomfort. The figure's silhouette was wrong, somehow. Too tall, too still. But I couldn't let myself get paranoid. It was just a ship, just another long shift. Before I could say anything else, Mike pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm getting a picture of this. Maybe someone will finally believe us, you know?" I opened my mouth to stop him, but the words died on my tongue. I knew Mike wasn't the type to back down once he set his mind on something. But something about the situation felt off. Too off. "Mike, don't!" I called, my voice sharper than I meant. He didn't hear me. Or if he did, he didn't care. He tapped the screen of his phone, and the flash lit up the deck in a blinding burst of white light. For a split second, everything went still. The shadows froze, and the mist seemed to part. What I saw in that brief instant is something I'll never be able to forget. It wasn't a person. Not really. The figure didn't have any clear features, no face, no hands, just a shifting, smoky outline that seemed to twist and distort, like it was trying to take shape but couldn't quite hold it. It was like it was made of darkness itself, only vaguely humanoid. The flash caught it at the wrong moment, and it turned toward us. The air around us crackled, and in an instant, Mike's phone exploded in his hand with a deafening crack. The force of it knocked him backward, and the screen shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the deck. "Mike!" I shouted, rushing toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I got closer, I could see his face contort in pain. He was clutching his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I knelt beside him, trying to help, but it was useless. His body went limp in my arms, and a horrible scream echoed in my head as I watched him vanish before my eyes. Just like that, gone. I screamed too, but it didn't matter. The ship loomed above us, cold and silent. By the time we reached him, it was as if Mike had never been there. No blood, no sign of struggle, just a vacant space where he had been standing. I stumbled back, looking around at the rest of the crew. No one else had seen what I had. No one had seen the figure, and no one had witnessed the moment the flash lit up the ship's deck. It was as if it hadn't happened at all. Mark and Steve rushed over, their faces pale. What happened? What's going on? I couldn't answer. I couldn't explain it. I could only stare at the empty spot where Mike had fallen. We searched the area for hours, calling his name, checking the ship, but he was gone. Just like Eric. The only trace of Mike was his broken phone. The screen cracked and scorched, the image on it distorted beyond recognition. We tried to make sense of it, but there was nothing to be done. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening here, whatever was on that ship, wasn't just some random accident. This was something else, something we weren't supposed to see. And I was beginning to think we might never get the chance to leave that night. The night felt heavier than ever. With 2 workers gone, Eric and Mike, and no answers to our questions, the crew was on edge. Every shadow seemed to hide something menacing. Every creak of the containers felt too deliberate. We moved through our tasks with minimal conversation, the usual camaraderie replaced with nervous glances and tense silence. We gathered around the dock, unloading crates, trying to distract ourselves from the chaos, but it was impossible. Mike had been gone for hours, and Hartman was still treating it like business as usual. No one dared question him anymore. He was a brick wall, as cold and unyielding as the containers we moved. "We can't just keep pretending everything's fine," I muttered to Mark as we lifted a particularly heavy crate. "2 people are gone, Mark. Gone, without a trace. How is this okay?" Mark shot me a look, but didn't reply, his face tight with fear. He was in the same boat, but talking about it only made it worse. The rules were etched into our minds now, and none of us dared break them, especially not after everything that had happened. Hartman's voice cut through the air as he walked past us, barking orders. "Keep moving, guys. We've got a schedule to keep." His words were as sharp as ever, but his eyes flickered with something else. Something I couldn't place. I watched him disappear into the shadows, then turned back to the task at hand. We were unloading crates, stacking them in the usual tight, organized rows. As I moved the last crate of the pile, my elbow brushed against the side of a container. It was unmarked, except for one thing, a strange, faded X that had been painted hastily across its side. I stepped back, brushing off my sleeve. The touch was so light, barely even a scrape, but something felt wrong. I paused for a moment, staring at the symbol. The X seemed to linger in my mind, almost as if it was calling to me, but I shook it off. No need to get paranoid. This was just another container, right? But then it happened. A sharp, tingling sensation ran up my arm, like an electrical charge. It wasn't painful, but the feeling was so sudden, so foreign, that I had to steady myself against the container. For a second I thought I might pass out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the container had done something to me. I pushed the thought away. "It's nothing," I told myself. "Just a freak sensation." Later that night, after we'd finished unloading, I went to the break room, trying to shake the strange feeling from my mind. I rolled up my sleeve absent-mindedly, and there it was, a bruise. It wasn't just any bruise. The marks on my arm were identical to the X I had brushed against earlier. The shape was too perfect, too deliberate to be an accident. The skin around it was dark, almost black in some places, as if something had pressed into me, something cold, something unnatural. I froze, staring at it. My heartbeat quickened, and my thoughts raced. What the hell had happened? I couldn't make sense of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I had bumped into something else. But the mark, the shape, I couldn't deny it. I didn't say anything to the others. What could I say? That a container bruised me? They'd think I was losing it, just like they probably thought about Eric and Mike. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't just dealing with a regular shipment anymore. I had brushed against that X, and now this was happening. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. I had to stay focused, had to finish the job. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't sure I could finish this job, not if the ship kept bringing more of these things. And Hartman, he seemed to know something, but I couldn't ask him. Not now. Not when the rules had taken on a life of their own and the price of breaking them seemed higher with every passing hour. So I covered the bruise with my sleeve, pretending it wasn't there, and went back to work. But deep down, I knew. The rules weren't just to keep us in line. They were keeping something else contained. We had to get through the night without any more incidents. But the pressure was building. The unease was palpable. That's when Steve finally reached his breaking point. We were taking a short break in the break room, huddled around a small table. He had been pacing back and forth, his fingers tapping restlessly on his coffee cup, eyes darting to the clock, then back to the door as if waiting for someone. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low growl. "You can't keep brushing this off, Hartman." Steve slammed his hard hat down on the table with a resounding clunk, the noise reverberating in the room, making everyone stop and look at him. First Eric, now Mike. They didn't just quit. This ship, it's different. What the hell is going on with it? Hartman, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, didn't even flinch. He took his time sipping his coffee before slowly setting the cup down on the table. The room seemed to grow colder as he met Steve's gaze with an unsettling calmness. "I've already told you," Hartman said, his tone flat, almost dismissive. "I don't know what you want me to say. I've reported the disappearances, but I'm not in charge of that part. Maybe they didn't like the hours. Maybe they found other jobs. It's not my problem." Steve didn't back down, his face flushed with frustration. "Not your problem. People are disappearing, Hartman. This isn't normal. You saw how they were acting before they left. This isn't just about the job, it's about them. And you're just going to pretend everything's fine?" Hartman sighed, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. His expression remained as cold as ever. "If you can't handle the work, you're free to quit. But let me remind you," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "this ship is worth more money than any of you will see in your lifetime. If you want to walk away from that, be my guest, but don't waste my time with these questions." The room fell silent. The anger in Steve's eyes was clear, but there was nothing he could say. The mention of the money hung between us like an unspoken truth. No one wanted to lose their job, especially not over something as vague as suspicion. The fear of the unknown, of the potential consequences of questioning Hartman too much, was enough to make us all hesitate. Mark stood up, his fists clenched at his sides, but no words came out. He, too, had been quiet, holding back his thoughts since the first disappearance, but now his frustration was visible. Everyone knew that speaking up against Hartman could jeopardize everything. The company was paying too well, and no one wanted to lose that. Hartman's eyes flicked across the group, his gaze settling on each of us with a detached, almost calculating look. After a moment, he stood up slowly, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. "Now I suggest you all get back to work," he said, his voice cool, even as it carried an underlying threat. "We're not finished here. The shift's not over yet." We filed out of the break room in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The rules, the strange atmosphere, the disappearances, nothing made sense. But one thing was clear. Hartman wasn't about to let us stop, no matter what happened, and we were all too afraid to push it further. As we returned to the docks, The weight of the conversation lingered. We were all uneasy, walking around the containers with our heads down, pretending nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just waiting for something else to happen. Later that night, I was working near the marked container when I heard it. A faint knocking sound coming from inside. At first, I thought it was just the ship settling or a piece of equipment shifting. But then it came again, faint, rhythmic, like someone tapping out a pattern from the inside. "Liam, you good?" Mark called from a few feet away, startling me out of my thoughts. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, taking a step back from the container, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But the sound didn't stop. It continued, almost like it was calling to me, a quiet insistence that made my skin crawl. I knew I should walk away, follow the rules, get back to work, but something about it held me in place. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding louder than the knocking. "Hello?" I whispered before I could stop myself, the words slipping out like a reflex. The knocking paused. For a moment, everything was still. Then it resumed, faster this time, almost frantic, like someone was desperate to get out. "Liam!" Mark's voice snapped me out of it. I looked up to see him staring at me, his face pale with concern. "What are you doing? Get away from there!" I stumbled back, shaking, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The moment I moved, the knocking stopped. It was as if the sound had never been there at all. I stood there, staring at the container, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain what had just happened. All I knew was that it felt wrong. Mark didn't say anything else, but his eyes were wide, filled with the same unease I was feeling. We both turned back to our work, though the silence felt heavier now, thicker with the unspoken tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. During our next break, the remaining workers gathered in the small break room. Steve was the first to speak up. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think Hartman knows more than he's letting on?" Mark, who had been staring down at his half-empty cup of coffee, didn't hesitate. "Of course he does. He's too calm about all this. He knows something, but he's playing it like it's business as usual. There's no way he's this detached." I stayed quiet, my thoughts racing. The bruises on my arm were itching now, the shape of the X burning into my skin. I rubbed at it absently, trying to ignore the sensation, but it didn't help. The container, just a metal box, a simple thing, seemed to be watching me. I couldn't explain it, but every time I glanced in its direction, it felt like it was aware of my every move, like it was waiting for something. Mark caught my eye and must have seen the distant look on my face. "You okay, Liam?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. "Yeah," I lied, "just tired." By the end of my shift, I was drained, physically and mentally. The constant stress, the strange occurrences, and the feeling that something was off had been wearing me down. I was just trying to get through the night. I was walking past the marked container when it happened. The sound of metal creaking reached my ears, and I froze. The container's doors were slowly opening on their own, almost like they were being pulled by an invisible force. I stood there, watching, unsure of what to do. It was pitch black inside, but there was something unsettling about the way the doors moved, as if they had their own agenda. Without thinking, I took a cautious step forward to get a better look. That's when I felt it, an icy, cold sensation wrapping around my arm. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me react. "Help!" I called out without thinking, panic rising in my chest. Mark and Steve were nearby and rushed to me. They grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me away, their hands firm and urgent. The cold sensation on my arm disappeared as quickly as it came, and the container's doors slammed shut with a loud clang. We didn't say anything at first, the shock of the moment hanging in the air. We just stood there, breathing heavily, unsure of what had just happened. "We need to stay away from that container," Mark said finally, his voice low. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond our understanding. The rules had always seemed odd, but now they felt like they were there for a reason. We didn't stick around to see what might happen next. But in that moment, I realized that the job wasn't just about the cargo or the ships. It was about following the rules. No matter what. I may have been lucky that I called for help and that Mark and Steve were there to pull me out. If they hadn't, I don't know what would have happened to me. I would have ended up like Eric, or Mike, or anyone else who's disappeared without a trace. The three of us burst into Hartman's office, out of breath and terrified. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, slamming my hands on his desk. "That container almost killed me!" Hartman looked genuinely shaken for the first time. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't know what's in that ship," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just know the owners pay us a fortune to unload it. They don't answer questions, they don't negotiate, they just send the rules and the money." "What about the missing workers?" Mark demanded. "Have you reported them?" Hartman nodded. "Of course I have, but every time I do, the reports disappear. HR tells me to stick to the rules and keep quiet. They don't care." Steve shook his head, disgusted. "You're putting all of us at risk for money? For what? Bonuses?" Hartman didn't respond. His face was tight, unwilling to admit more, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We're not doing it," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not coming back for the next shipment. Whatever's on that ship, it's not worth our lives." Hartman's gaze hardened, and his voice became sharp. "You think I want this? You think I can stop it? If we don't unload the ship, the port goes under. I'll lose everything." We didn't say anything after that. He wasn't going to cancel it, no matter how many lives were at risk. Furious and terrified, we made a pact that night. We wouldn't stay for the next arrival. The next evening, as the mysterious ship departed, the faint glow of its containers seemed to flicker in the thick mist, casting an eerie light over the dock. The distant knocking sounded again, a rhythmic echo that seemed to follow the ship as it moved farther into the fog. I stood there, frozen, staring at the ship as it vanished into the darkness, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. I kept asking myself, why was the ship like this? Why did it carry such horrors? Why were we told to unload it, knowing the risks? The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that there was something far bigger at play, something beyond us. Maybe this ship wasn't meant for us at all. Maybe it was just a small piece of something much larger, something that existed outside the boundaries of our understanding. Maybe the owners of the ship, the ones who kept it coming back to our port, weren't human at all. They didn't care about the rules or the lives of the workers. They cared about something else. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the ship was more of a vessel for something else. The cargo wasn't just containers or goods. It was a gateway to something ancient or otherworldly, something that didn't belong in our world. Why did they pick us? Because we were expendable. We were just workers who would follow orders to the letter, because we had no choice. They knew we wouldn't question the rules. They knew we'd unload it, no matter what. But now, after everything that happened, I couldn't help but wonder if the horrors on that ship were meant for us. Maybe they didn't just want the cargo unloaded. They wanted something more. Maybe the ship carried more than just physical goods. Maybe it was a test, a way to sift through the weak, to find those who would follow blindly and those who might dare to question. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe for more creepy tales. If you'd like to support the channel, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps. Links in the description.